It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. Detroit and Windsor sit across a narrow river from each other, close enough to see the lights on the other side. For most of the last 100 years, they lived like one town in two countries. Car parts crossed the water again and again before a single car was finished. Families, music, and Saturday nights moved back and forth with a constant rhythm. Then after 9/11, crossing got harder, longer waits, tougher searches. Soon, the two cities will cut the ribbon on something new between them, the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Now that ribbon cutting was scheduled for tomorrow, but we learned this morning that's been postponed, and officials aren't saying why. Prime Minister Mark Carney has called the bridge a symbol, but also a fact of cooperation. And yet it comes at a tense moment. President Trump has threatened to block it, wrongly claiming the U.S. would get nothing from a bridge that Michigan actually co-owns. So what does this bridge, the first public one at this border, do for two cities like these? And for the people who've spent their lives crossing between them? My guest has studied this for years. Lee Rodney is a border culture scholar at the University of Windsor. Professor Rodney, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, Robyn. Thanks for the generous introduction and for having me on the show.
Before we get into your work on the Detroit-Windsor border, I want to begin with the news of the moment. The Gordie Howe Bridge was set for a ribbon cutting tomorrow, and we just learned, as I mentioned this morning, that it's been delayed, and we don't have info on its rescheduling. What was your reaction to that?
I'm not terribly surprised. I was surprised to hear at the beginning of the week that the ribbon cutting was scheduled for tomorrow. So I think it really is anyone's guess as to how far into the future we're looking to see its official opening.
As someone who has studied the importance of borders and cross-cultural connection, is this frustrating to you to see this delay? And as you said, you were surprised that it even was to be potentially scheduled for this week or next week.
Well, we've been waiting for over a year now, to have an official opening date, and those dates change a lot. Of course, it's disappointing, yes. But I do think there's a significant difference between, say, a nationalist lens to this project and a regional view. And I think that the main thing that a lot of us in the two cities are looking to see in the coming years after it is opened is what this means for the internal workings of the cities. How that might open things up in different ways and make new patterns of movement.
And I do want to get into that, but first I want to go back a little bit, because in order to really ground ourselves in this moment, in the significance of the Gordie Howe Bridge, we do have to step back. You've written about Detroit and Windsor as one of the most tightly woven border regions anywhere. A single car part crossing the river as many as 7 times before the car was even finished. Families and music moving back and forth like the line was barely there. Then after 9/11, getting across got slower and heavier. What did that change for the people who lived it?
I think I need to interject a slightly personal viewpoint here. I mean, I moved to the region in 2005, and when I moved here, people were almost apologetic to say, it used to be so much better. It used to be so easy to cross to, have lunch in Detroit. There was a much more connected sense of what the region was and what the city experience was. And that was changing rapidly when I first moved here. And, the border infrastructure got, more and more complex and complicated and started to impact how and when people crossed and the preparations, and there was no possibility for just going over for lunch anymore. It had to be kind of planned out a week in advance. And that sort of thing. So that got me doing research into what the urban plan had been over the last century, how that was impacted by, a whole variety of different phases of urban planning. Most notably like the spoke and wheel pattern that we're familiar with when we look at the downtown core of Detroit. That was sort of the first urban plan that's still with us today, and that got bisected and intersected by the freeways when those were built, I think, in the 1950s, right? So, and then on our side, the Highway 401 was another infrastructure project that was incompleted. And, so in a certain way, the cities have never been connected by the mechanisms that, the national infrastructure projects kind of laid out somewhere in the middle of the last century. And then that was sort of left hanging until 9/11 hit. And then all of a sudden things were really broken. So I think, what we're seeing now with the Gordie Howe Bridge is a solution to a problem that had emerged over a long period of time. It didn't emerge overnight. I mean, I think it hit us overnight in 20 odd years ago. But I think we're hopeful that some of the congestion and the pollution that emerged from those two freeway systems never being fully connected will start to change things locally. But
Professor?
I think. Sorry.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned, and that is that when you got to this area, to this region, you said that was in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
And people were saying to you, they were apologetic. Oh, it things used to feel so much more connective and more spontaneous. If I have studied you correctly, that hardening, that was exactly what inspired you to drive the border bookmobile, right? That's a little library about the border. This hardening inspired you to drive it back and forth across the border, asking people on both sides how a tougher border had changed them. Do I have that right?
Yeah. I mean, sorry, that was a project that came out of my arrival here and trying to understand how people narrated or thought of the places that they lived in. And also, we're responding to the changes in, showing identity at the border. I think the passport regulation only came into effect in 2008. So, you used to be able to just show your driver's license, then it meant applying for a passport. And there are all kinds of barriers to access that popped up that, were not anticipated. And I think that's when the moment of disconnection started in in many ways, I think. And then the bookmobile was also a kind of comparative project to try and understand how borders were shifting and borderlands, places, cities, regions that are situated on international borders, how they're changing around the world. It's not just here, but trying to find some kind of comparative framework for that.
Sure. I mean, yes, this is reflective of border culture in many different places. I mean, I'm wondering what surprised you most driving the border bookmobile back and forth when it comes to the conversations that you were having with people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Yeah. No, I learned a lot. I think I was kind of most surprised at how it impacted people living in the downtown core. And, people would tell me about, I guess it was probably back in the 70s or 80s, but there used to be a pedestrian crossing on the Ambassador Bridge. People would use that. They would stop in the middle of the bridge and look up and down the river. And, that would be a kind of day trip. I've heard about people in downtown Detroit coming to the Windsor waterfront and looking back at their city, getting some distance on it, writing poetry from the Windsor waterfront. The economy of the day trip and the idea of just going to another country for a day. So many people talked about that in different ways and what it meant to them. They also talked a lot about, getting hauled in and, stuff that happened in terms of being in secondary. They were very generous with what they shared with me, and not all of it, made it to the little videos or to the writings that I did on the project. I did it for about 3 years, and then the van died. But the minivan itself was a kind of symbol of that just-in-time manufacturing that really was, brought into being in this part of the world.
Do you think we could get back to that place in time, the days of the carefree cross-border day trip?
um, I guess I can always try to be hopeful. I think at the moment it's hard to see that. The one thing that does give me hope is that they've built in a pedestrian or active transportation lane. I think that's going to change things. I think that's something that people have been longing for a while, is not having to get in your own car or arrange drives over to cross the border. Traveling by automobile has made it difficult for a lot of people, and it is a bit remote to get onto the bridge and over the bridge. It would be kind of a long haul for a lot of people, but the possibility is there. And as far as I understand, it's intended to be a free crossing. You don't have to pay $8 Canadian or $5.25 US to cross, and it does add up, right?
So for you, as a scholar of border culture, I understand that this project overall feels pretty hopeful to you. And there's another aspect of it that I realize is also hopeful, and it has to do with the neighborhoods that are right next to the bridge. So I'm thinking about Sandwich in Windsor and Delray in Detroit. Now, these were already some of the most polluted around. And during the planning phases for the Gordie Howe Bridge, residents pushed hard and they won a lot of real protections. I'm thinking about home repairs and air monitors and money invested back into the area. The question is whether it's enough. I mean, and the question I pose to you, can a project this big actually leave these communities better off?
Mm-hmm. I think I'll answer the question by indicating that infrastructure projects of this scale are generally not great for communities. But I do think the Gordie Howe is a reasonable solution to, a very complex problem in terms of international border management in the 21st century. I think we're all waiting to see what this will mean in terms of returning streets to the people that live and work here. And the project points in the right direction in connecting West Windsor and Southwest Detroit, which I actually think these two communities have much more in common than we are being made aware of. They've been at the center of heavy industry for over a century. And as you mentioned, in the last 2 decades, they've been at the center of community consultation, but they've also been dragged into a kind of international political fight in terms of where the international trade traffic lands, right? And in critical border studies, they refer to these big infrastructure projects as blockbusting, right? And that links up to what we're familiar with the ways that freeways have familiarly now divided the downtown, or the seamlessness of the downtown fabric that was in Detroit a while ago.
So blockbusting, meaning disrupting the block, essentially.
Effectively, yes.
So go on. You see, you're saying that overall, this type of infrastructure has been quite damaging, but you see this moment with the Gordie Howe Bridge of being a hopeful moment. I mean, you have talked about the ways this is going to connect people to the Ojibwe Park in Windsor. I mean, talk about that.
Yeah. And again, I think, this is a complex problem. I also think it's worth noting for people who aren't familiar with the area or haven't been around the area in a while, that the area is studied in contrast, right? There's a major green belt on the Canadian side, the Ojibwe Prairie Complex, Black Oak Park. These are naturalized and protected areas that back on right onto heavy industry, right? So even without the bridge, that's already there. And I think what the bridge has done, or will hopefully do, is make a better connection between those two communities in terms of access to naturalized areas. And it might also help us envision what the region might look like without such a heavy reliance on cars to cross the border. It also might shift our reasons for doing so, like walking in a park might be more important than, say, driving out to the mall for a day trip, right?
I hope
So I
so.
think it might reorient us, right, in positive ways.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent, and my guest is Lee Rodney, a border culture scholar at the University of Windsor. We're talking about the new Gordie Howe International Bridge between Windsor and Detroit, ahead of what was supposed to be tomorrow's ribbon cutting, which has been postponed. And we're discussing what it means for two cities that have always felt closer than the border has made them feel. So we would be remiss not to acknowledge this. Earlier this year, the Gordie Howe Bridge stopped being about Windsor or Detroit at all. And you have mentioned this, Professor Rodney. I mean, it became a bargaining chip between Ottawa and Washington, with President Trump threatening to padlock it to win a trade fight. The people, meanwhile, who actually live here had no say. And this has been frustrating for a lot of folks on both sides of the river. What's it like to watch your community's future get used to settle a fight between governments far away?
Um, I think, my experience here over 2 decades has made me realize that the way that the border appears in national and international media, and even in local media to a certain degree, is always in terms of economic or humanitarian crisis. And I don't think that necessarily reflects what it's actually like to live on or near a border. Obviously, these things do impact borderlands communities significantly, but I think the reporting tends to toe in a certain direction, and ignores the ways that these same communities are and have been at the forefront of navigating these crises. I think we do the heavy lifting here and the fine-grained analysis of what actually takes place locally and regionally. So the Gordie Howe planning process, I think, is really important to remember, started 2 decades ago from people on both sides of the border, or both sides of the river, wanting a solution to the problems of intercity traffic, the air pollution that came from the, quote, trade volume, which I think obviously is an abstraction at best, that we experienced on the Windsor side, as 6 lanes of traffic backed up at 14 traffic lights just across the Ambassador Bridge. So in 2005, the world saw those images of the traffic lines, but the stories about the diesel particulate that degraded the air quality close to the campus where I work, as well as some smaller stories but really powerful ones about pedestrian deaths of kids crossing to go to a nearby high school. I think these stories failed to make the same impact on this international stage, and I realize that cities around the world are dealing with these kinds of problems, and they're also all over Metro Detroit and Windsor.
So you're
big
saying
problems,
that
yeah.
You lament some of the narratives that have rose in the national media headlines about what it means to live along this border, and what you see the Detroit-Windsor border as is also a place where solutions come to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess going back to that planning process, I think it's kind of characterized the last 20 years, and I think that part of the story is not getting picked up as much as it should. It is maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs down in reporting that it was a planning process that was brokered by the municipalities of Windsor and Detroit, but also by Ontario and Michigan. And I think 98% of the work was done at those levels and locally. So the last 2% of the last mile has been carried in the context of this trade war, and that's really unfortunate. But I do think that that the community bases of our borderlands community and the ones I've witnessed along the U.S.-Mexico border, I think borderlands communities have the power to devise really good working solutions to maintain neighborly relationships, and maybe doing the work of care or soft power in spending the time to plan and do those community consultations, as well as the environmental monitoring to understand the impact of large scale border crossings like the one we have here.
Lee Rodney, border culture scholar at the University of Windsor and creator of the Border Bookmobile. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you, Robyn.
It's the Metro on WDET. Coming up, as we've been discussing, the opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge has been delayed, but there's still excitement about the project from people on both sides of the Detroit River. We'll hear from Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens about why he believes the bridge is significant to both Canadians and Americans. That's next on the Metro. Stay with us.